It was time, really. The reason all of us in the Beatles shied away from Beatles material directly after the breakup.
When people think of Paul McCartney, they think of the charming Beatle with the melodic bass lines and boyish smile. The songwriter who penned Yesterday, a cultural icon who helped revolutionize popular music. But behind the knighthood and cheerful persona lies a man with definite opinions about his musical contemporaries. Paul can be brutally honest when it comes to music. This was revealed by former Wings guitarist Danny Lane in a rare 2018 interview.
There's kind of between me and Paul, there was always that competition, a friendly competition still, you know. Can you come up with something, or can I?
I've always thought the Rolling Stones were a blues cover band that got lucky. That's not some random internet troll talking about one of rock's biggest bands. That's Sir Paul McCartney. Yes, the nice Beatle himself, in a private recording session, absolutely destroying the Rolling Stones' reputation with surgical precision. If you think Paul McCartney spent his career being the diplomatic gentleman the public sees, you're about to discover a completely different side of music's most beloved icon. Behind that charming smile and those melodic bass lines lies one of rock history's most competitive and sometimes ruthless personalities. How many of you thought Paul was always the nice Beatle who stayed above the drama? Well, comment below after you hear what he really said about some of music's biggest names behind closed doors, because what I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see this musical legend forever. Let's start with the big one. The Beatles versus Rolling Stones rivalry defined a generation. But what fans never saw was how deeply personal Paul made it behind those Abbey Road walls. Picture this. It's a late-night recording session in 1968. Paul's working with producer George Martin when suddenly he stops mid-song and says, "I've always thought the Rolling Stones were a blues cover band that got lucky." But wait, there's more. Paul didn't just dismiss their music. He questioned their entire creative process. According to former Apple Records executive Peter Brown, Paul always felt the Stones were following in their footsteps, releasing similar album concepts months after the Beatles had already broken that ground. Here's where it gets really petty, though. When John Lennon briefly considered producing a Rolling Stones album in 1969, studio engineer Jeff Emmerich witnessed Paul's reaction firsthand. He was visibly irritated, questioning why John would waste his talents on them when the Beatles had their own projects needing attention. But the most revealing moment came decades later. In that 2021 New Yorker interview, Paul still couldn't resist the dig. "I'm not sure I should say it, but they're a blues cover band. That's sort of what the Stones are. I think our net was cast a bit wider than theirs." Mick Jagger fired right back, calling the Beatles a four-piece band with one drummer, while joking about the Stones still filling stadiums. Who do you think influenced whom more, the Beatles or the Stones? Because this rivalry shaped both bands in ways you won't believe. But if Paul thought the Stones were copying them, his reaction to punk rock was about to get nuclear. When the Sex Pistols exploded onto the scene in 1976, they weren't just playing music. They were declaring war on everything Paul McCartney had spent a decade building. Linda McCartney's brother, John Eastman, revealed something that'll blow your mind. Paul considered their music to be an assault on his ears. He couldn't understand why anyone would celebrate not being able to play their instruments properly. But here's what really got under Paul's skin. They weren't just rejecting his music, they were targeting him personally. According to Wings drummer Danny Sywell, Paul was particularly wounded when he heard the Sex Pistols were using Beatles posters for target practice during rehearsals. He tried to laugh it off, but you could tell it bothered him deeply, Sywell recalled. Now here's where this story gets absolutely explosive. Both acts ended up recording in adjacent studios at London's Air facility in early 1977. Studio manager Dave Harris witnessed what happened next, and it's the kind of rock and roll confrontation that legends are made of. Paul, being Paul, made a friendly gesture to introduce himself to the punk revolutionaries. Remember, this is the diplomatic Beatle who always tried to keep things civil. Apparently, Sid Vicious muttered something about establishment sellouts. According to Harris, McCartney turned on his heel and never acknowledged them again. Can you imagine? The man who tried to bridge every musical gap suddenly faced artists who wanted to burn down his entire legacy. Were you around during the punk explosion? Did you pick a side between the establishment and the rebellion? Because this cultural war was about to get even more personal. From punk rebellion to shameless copying, Paul's next targets hit closer to home. The 1990s brought Oasis, self-proclaimed Beatles disciples, with Noel Gallagher openly worshipping Paul's songwriting. You'd think this hero worship would flatter the master, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. According to McCartney's longtime publicist Jeff Baker, Paul found their Beatles obsession tiresome and borderline insulting. He felt they were reducing his life's work to a handful of copied chords and recycled melodies during a private dinner in 1997. And this is exclusive insider information. Paul reportedly told George Martin, "They've got the swagger right, but where's the innovation? We never just copied our heroes, we transformed them." But here's what pushed Paul over the edge. When Noel Gallagher claimed in a 1996 interview that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles, McCartney was absolutely furious. Beatles biographer Philip Norman revealed Paul called such comparisons ridiculous and privately dismissed the band as arrogant upstarts with half the talent and twice the ego. The most awkward moment happened at the 2000 Q Music Awards. Both McCartney and Oasis were receiving honors, and backstage, Liam Gallagher approached Paul for an autograph. One witness described McCartney as cordial but clearly uncomfortable throughout the exchange. Imagine your musical hero treating you like a nuisance fan rather than a fellow artist. But if Paul thought Oasis was derivative, his opinion of the Monkees was absolutely savage. He considered them a plastic imitation and would change radio stations whenever their songs played. What really got to him was when the Monkees TV show started incorporating psychedelic elements right after Sgt. Pepper's release. George Harrison remembered, Paul would get properly wound up about it. He'd say, "They're following our blueprint without doing any of the work. Do you think imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, or is it artistic theft?" Because Paul's next rivalry was about to prove that competition could get devastatingly personal. But copying wasn't Paul's only competition concern. Commercial success was about to hit him where it really hurt. Astonished, picture this. It's 1978, and Paul McCartney watches three brothers from Australia achieve something that must have felt like a knife to his artistic heart. Selling more records than the Beatles ever did with a single soundtrack. Producer Chris Thomas, who worked with both acts, revealed something that explains Paul's entire personality. Paul felt blindsided by disco. Here were these three brothers suddenly selling more records than the Beatles ever did with Saturday Night Fever, and he took it personally. But here's what really ate at Paul. The Bee Gees had started as Beatles soundalikes in the 1960s, then transformed into disco superstars. According to Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber, Paul would listen to their falsetto harmonies and mutter about how they'd abandoned their original sound for commercial gain. Now get this, both acts were recorded at the same Miami studio in 1979, and studio manager Tony Bongiovi witnessed something that reveals Paul's competitive obsession. Paul would schedule his sessions to avoid running into them. When someone mentioned the Bee Gees had broken another chart record, he visibly tensed up. Imagine being Paul McCartney, arguably the most successful songwriter in history, and feeling threatened by disco. When the Bee Gees were being hailed as songwriting geniuses for their disco reinvention, Paul told his band members, "They're using the same 3 chords as everyone else. They've just sped them up and added a drum machine." Here's how deep this rivalry went. Even when Maurice Gibb died in 2003, Paul's condolence statement was notably brief and impersonal compared to other artists' heartfelt tributes. After decades, those competitive wounds had never fully healed. Were you Team Beatles or Team Bee Gees during the disco era? Because Paul's most intense rivalry was yet to come, and this one almost broke 2 musical geniuses. But Paul's most obsessive competition was with America's sunshine pop pioneers, and this creative war changed music history. Dramatic. Here's the rivalry that music historians still debate. Paul McCartney versus Brian Wilson. What started as mutual admiration became an obsession that pushed both artists to their creative limits and beyond. Legendary producer Phil Spector nailed it. Paul and Brian were like 2 chess grandmasters. Each move one made, the other had to top. It started friendly but turned into an obsession for both of them. When Paul first heard Pet Sounds in 1966, producer George Martin witnessed something remarkable. Paul was both inspired and threatened. He played it constantly, analyzing every note. Then he'd say, "We need to go further than this." That direct competition led to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Without Brian Wilson pushing Paul's boundaries, we might never have gotten the Beatles' masterpiece. Cruel. But here's where Paul's competitive edge turned cruel. When Brian Wilson shelved his ambitious Smile album amid mental health struggles, Paul was allegedly dismissive. Beatles roadie Mal Evans recalled Paul saying, "If you can't finish what you start, you shouldn't be in this business. We push through no matter what." Think about that for a moment. Here's a fellow artist struggling with his mental health, and Paul's response was essentially, "Winners finish, losers quit." The relationship reached its breaking point during a disastrous 1967 dinner party at Brian Wilson's home. According to Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson, Paul criticized several Beach Boys songs as simplistic and suggested their harmonies were predictable. Paul left thinking he'd given helpful feedback, Dennis Wilson recalled. Brian didn't speak for days afterwards. Even decades later, Paul can't fully acknowledge Brian's influence. In a 1993 interview, he conspicuously minimized their impact. "They did lovely harmonies, but I think people overstate how much they influenced us. We were already well on our way." Here's the most telling example. When discussing God Only Knows, a song Paul has called perfect, he can't resist adding qualifiers like "for American pop music" or "of that period." Even when praising Brian Wilson, Paul needs to maintain his competitive edge. Pet Sounds versus Sgt. Pepper. Which album do you think changed music more? Because this rivalry reveals something profound about what drove Paul McCartney's entire career. So what do all these feuds tell us about the real Paul McCartney? Here's the surprising truth about all these rivalries. They weren't really about the other bands at all. They were about Paul McCartney's relentless drive to protect and expand the Beatles' legacy at any cost. Think about it from Paul's perspective. After the Beatles broke up, he was the one left carrying the torch. John went avant-garde with Yoko, George found spiritual peace, Ringo had his moments, but Paul felt responsible for maintaining their musical supremacy. Every band we've discussed represented a different threat to that legacy. The Rolling Stones challenged their creative authenticity. The Sex Pistols attacked their cultural relevance. Oasis and the Monkees diminished their innovation. The Bee Gees threatened their commercial supremacy. The Beach Boys pushed their artistic boundaries. Here's what's fascinating. These rivalries actually made everyone better. The Beatles created Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band specifically to top Pet Sounds. The Rolling Stones developed their own identity partly to distinguish themselves from the Beatles' comparisons. Even the Sex Pistols needed an establishment to rebel against. Music historian David Leaf put it perfectly about the Beach Boys' rivalry. Paul respects Brian's work, but he'll never fully acknowledge how much it pushed him. That would mean admitting someone else drove the Beatles' evolution. And you know what? That competitive fire is still burning. At 82 years old, Paul McCartney continues touring, recording, and proving he's still relevant. Those rivalries didn't break him. They forged him into the relentless musical legend we know today. So here's my question for you. Which Paul McCartney feud shocked you the most? Was it the savage dismissal of the Rolling Stones, the studio confrontation with the Sex Pistols, or maybe that cruel reaction to Brian Wilson's mental health struggles? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me. Do you respect Paul more or less knowing about his competitive side? Because personally, I think these rivalries reveal the real secret to lasting success in music. Never, ever stop caring about being the best. What we've discovered today completely changes how we see Paul McCartney. Behind that diplomatic smile and those melodic bass lines is one of music's most competitive spirits, a man who turned every potential threat into fuel for his own creative fire. From blues cover bands to punk rebels, from disco superstars to sunshine pop geniuses, Paul saw them all as challenges to overcome, rather than artists to admire. And maybe that's exactly what made him immortal. If you enjoyed discovering the real Paul McCartney behind the public persona, here's what I need you to do. First, smash that like button because this kind of behind-the-scenes research takes serious time to uncover. Second, subscribe and hit the notification bell because next week we're diving into John Lennon's secret feuds. And trust me, Paul looks diplomatic compared to what John said about his rivals. I'm talking about the time John publicly destroyed a legendary singer's career with just one interview answer, and the rock star who made John so angry he wrote a song specifically to humiliate them. Until then, keep discovering the untold stories behind rock's greatest legends, and remember, sometimes the best music comes from the biggest rivalries.